Today we're going to talk about stat blocks, monster stat blocks. In particular, when are the right times to use complicated stat blocks versus the right times to use simple stat blocks? There are, now that 5e has expanded in so many different ways, we have lots of different kinds of monsters that we can use in our game. It's not, even though they're all fully 5e compatible, it's not like you always just find monster stat blocks. The design of monsters varies a lot across different publishers and across different product types. For example, your 2014 D&D monsters were designed one particular way. The ones being designed by Kobold Press for Black Flag and for Tales of the Valiant are designed a different way. The ones that were designed for the Monstrous Menagerie by Level Up 5e, that's done a different way. And Flea Mortals has a whole different approach. The MCDM book Flea Mortals has a different way that they handle their monsters. And then I have the book that I wrote with Teo Sabadia and Scott Gray called Forge of Foes, which handles monsters a completely different way. The neat thing is there's all of these different monster styles, and they're all fully compatible with 5e. You can play them in any version of 5e that you are running. You can plug them in and out. You can try one monster in one type. You can try another monster in another type. I have been doing some of this in my own games, and it's been really interesting and insightful, and I wanted to share some of the experiences that I had. For example, I've been running some large battles where I would use like a big, meaty, chunky monster from Flea Mortals, and then I would have a bunch of smaller monsters that were kind of support monsters, but I would just use straight Forge of Foes stat blocks for those. And the advantage is I don't have to manage a whole ton of different stat blocks that all have lots of crunchy bits to them. I can put all the crunchy bits on one particular monster stat block and then have other guys that are throwing damage out and are taking damage in and are moving around and doing stuff. But I don't have to give them a lot of features. I don't have to worry about a lot of features. Sometimes I could just improvise the abilities that they get. So we're going to examine a couple of different kinds of stat blocks and think about how we can switch these up. So we're going to look at 3 different kinds of stat blocks from a degree of super, super simple to super crunchy with lots of different abilities. And then one that's kind of in the middle. So the 3 that I'm going to pick on today, 3 books that I think are all outstanding. One, of course, is my own book. 2 other books were some of my favorite books that have been published for monsters, which is the Level Up Advanced 5e Monstrous Menagerie, my favorite book it's my favorite monster book, period. But outside of Forge of Foes. But it is more straightforward, standard monster stat blocks that you would expect. And then Flea Mortals, which is like what I would consider to be like an advanced monster book, monsters that really have a particular focus on tactical play. So I think we're kind of spanning a good wide range of different stat blocks. So in Forge of Foes, we have this idea called general use combat stat blocks. And the idea here was to make these very easy, reskinnable monster stat blocks at particular challenge ratings that meant you could use them across the wide range of DD, all the way from CR18 creatures up to CR15. So, and 4 different stat blocks: CR18, CR1/2, CR2, CR4, CR7, CR11, and CR15. And as you can see, even these big ones, these high-level CR11 stat blocks, are very, very straightforward, right? They have 11 AC 17, 165 hit points. They make 4 attacks, plus 9 for each attack, 18 damage. So there's no special abilities on this. The idea behind Forge of Foes is you would grab one of these core stat blocks, and then you could plug in monster powers, which you can find in the books to kind of fill them out. You can also sort of improvise different monster powers, which is what I've been doing in some of my games. So I find that it's really easy to use just a core stat block, particularly for a monster that isn't the focus of the battle, but is somebody that's around. So an example that I can describe is a vampire fight that I had in my relatively high level. They're level 12 characters, and they were fighting a vampire matron mother, like a reverend mother of this evil goddess. And she was a vampire. And I used for her stat block was really important. So for her, I used the Van Glauer stat block from Flea Mortals because I wanted a big, nasty, crunchy vampire. Now, I also have the advantage that I wrote Van Glauer for Flea Mortals, so I kind of knew what I was getting into. But as you can see, like Van Glauer as a stat block is a full page. Lots of different things going on. First of all, very high power, CR19. I reduced the power a bit because it's CR19 with all the dudes that I threw in the battle was going to be too much. So, but spear sacrificing, spears for legendary actions, spear attacks that they could make. He can make, or she, because I reskinned her as him into her. Sanguinus, the big longsword that was hacking people and doing tons of damage. Some of the villain actions, I didn't end up using all of the villain actions, but I had them there. The Withering Gaze, Lots of different things, that the beguiling bonus action. So lots of different things that Van Glauer, and that in my version of it, was able to use in combat. But I certainly didn't want this level of complication for all of the monsters. Now, there are some really excellent vampire stat blocks that aren't very difficult, like the CR5 vampire spawn in here, right? Has a very straightforward stat block that isn't really crazy, with inhuman speed, bite and claw attacks, and everything like that. So very straightforward. The main vampire stat block is a little crunchier, right? The CR13 is a little crunchier. And then I said, okay, but I want to have like vampire sword masters. I wanted human priestesses that supported her, but that aren't vampires. I wanted armored Hezro that she had summoned from the realm known as the Blood Vaults. I made another plane called the Blood Vaults, which is like the plane of evil vampire types. And I wanted Hezro, like vampiric Hezro, these big, nasty, armored Hezro demons that were summoned. So I wanted great big brutes. I wanted vampire priestesses, human priestesses, vampire swordmasters, and the high priestess who is a vampire. And what I decided to do, which worked very well, was I used, look at that art. Isn't that art great? Van Glauer's art is fantastic. Really, really awesome. I used the Van Glauer stat block for the main one. And then I used Forge of Foes stat blocks for everything else. Now, in my case, I used, it's probably the equivalent of specials. I actually used a lot of CR5s. So I jumped it up one challenge rating by using the stats for monster challenge ratings at CR5. But all I did was have to write down one line of the stats for that. And I improvised everything. I gave the vampires like quick movement. Again, I probably could have used that vampire spawn, and that probably would have been just fine. Looking at it, I was like, I probably should have used that. But I gave them very similar abilities. They had ability bonus action to beguile somebody and make them kneel. It never worked. And then we had a big joke between the swordmasters that do we even have a thing? Do we even have the ability to beguile? I don't even think we have that ability. So that was kind of funny. But I did have them do some fast movement so they could move around. And then I just gave them multiple attacks, and I didn't have them do drain life or anything like that. The Hezros, I used something closer to this, like CR7. I think I used CR6. But they were great big guys that moved around. They punched. I took one of these attacks and turned it into a necrotic aura so that anybody that started within 15 feet of them took about half of the damage. So it's 17. They took about 8 points of damage for starting near the Hezro from the necrotic aura around the Hezro. And then I gave it one less attack. So it did 2 attacks instead of 3 attacks. They ended up taking more damage from the aura than they did from the attacks, which isn't surprising. But all I needed were these really simple stat blocks for my small monsters, and then a great big crunchy stat block for my main monster. And that worked really well. And when I think about how to use these different monster stat blocks in different ways, that to me is the real answer about when to use one over the other, which is how much does the abilities of a monster matter to the battle? There are some times for big battles where you want to have monsters with lots of interesting abilities. And then there's times where it kind of doesn't matter. No one cares. The reality is that players are interested in watching the players do interesting things. And GMs are busy keeping the story going and managing the tactics of the bigger monsters. So I think that is a balance that we can take when we're looking at which monsters we want to run at any given time. I actually think you can go really, really far running 5e games with just the stat blocks that we have in Forge of Foes. I've started doing that more and more in my own games. And I know I'm like eating my own dog food here, but really like it feels like I can use the stat blocks per CR table to run pretty much any monster that I want. And I'm experienced enough to know how to add new abilities and powers to those monsters when I want to by improvising them when the monster comes on the table. So we can kind of look at it and say, you look at an example of like the Myrmidon, right? It's very, very small stat block, right? Really, really thin. No special abilities, no special defenses, nothing else, where we just have the armor class, the hit points, number of attacks. We have some base saving throws, but you can move these around. You're actually supposed to move these around based on the type of monster and which saving throw makes sense for them to have. Some other basic stuff that you would have in here, but then the main thing is the number of attacks they do and the amount of damage that they do per the attacks. Very, very simple. Kind of going a level up, if you would. A level up from that would be the Monsters from the Monsters Menagerie Level Up Advanced 5e. I've described this book many, many times. I think it is a very, very well-balanced core monster book. I really, really like it. And whenever I am using core stat blocks, this is the book that I go to. I haven't touched the 20, and not because I'm like, oh, I hate it, but like I find these monsters so better designed that I go to this book way more than I go to the 2014 Dungeon Master or the 2014 Monster Manual. This one has completely replaced the 2014 Monster Manual for me, just because I find it better balanced. I like the monsters. There's a lot more going on here. There's a lot more tools in it, and you can kind of see the stat blocks here are a little thicker. So you have like a Cutthroat, a CR1 Cutthroat. They don't have a version of this, right? It does a sneak attack and has a sneak attack. All pretty basic stuff, like really fun. Clearly like acts like a rogue, but isn't totally out of hand with all of the stuff that it does. Very straightforward sort of stat blocks. I'm picking on the NPCs because I know the NPCs kind of fit this style. Your Bandit Captain is actually pretty similar to the Bandit Captain that you would find in 2014, which is the other nice thing about this book is when the 2014 Monster Manual did it well, they copied a lot of that over here because it's all under the system resource document. But you're going to get much more straightforward monsters in a book like this that have abilities that you might want to use when you want to give them some other things. Like Occult Fanatic has spells, Inflict Wounds, Blindness and Deafness, Hold Person, Sacred Flame, right? The Cult Fanatic in here has a lot of different things it does. But sometimes you don't need all of this stuff. You're like, look, I'm going to have a battle with 12 Cult Fanatics. I don't need all of them doing a bunch of different kinds of spells. I just want them pouring damage out, right? They want to be doing cult stuff. And that's when you're like, okay, I'm going to pick instead I'm going to use the Brute stat block, also CR2, but I'm going to reskin it to a Cult Fanatic. And it's going to say CR2 Cult Fanatic, same stats, only instead of having like a strength, a con save, it's going to be a wisdom save. You kind of move these things around. But then you say, no, the Cult Fanatic fires 2 cult blasts, like necrotic blast. You think a little bit more than that. Like, what kind of cultist are they? Are they like an aberration cultist? Well, then they call tentacles out of the ground that reach around and grab you, and they do +5 to hit and 9 damage, and they do 2 attacks. Right? You don't need all the other spells. You don't need all the other stuff. You don't need that crunch because you're running 9 of these dudes, right? Well, you don't have to figure out all the spells that they have. And it's pretty rare when you even need any of them to do a spell. But if you really need one of them to do a spell, then you can just improvise the spell. But generally speaking, especially when you have lots of monsters, that's when you want their stat block to be super simple. Going to kind of the other extreme, we have the monsters from Flea Mortals. So then you kind of look at the difference, and we talk about the Cult Fanatic is a good example that we can use across all 3 of these, right? The Human Death Cultist is sort of the Cult Fanatic of the Flea Mortals book. Now it's CR4 instead of CR2, so it's a little bit of a meatier creature than we would have from our CR2. And it's got like a scythe attack that does extra necrotic damage. That's cool. It's got a death bolt, so it can do +6 to hit, 14 damage. Blackfire Blessing. Cultist empowers up to 10 non-minion allies within 30 feet for 1 minute or until the cultist dies. Each creature's weapons burn with Blackfire, dealing an extra 2 necrotic damage. So it's got this support roll. You can see that it's got a support roll where it's doing things. Rise My Minions. The cultist chooses up to 3 creatures within 30 feet who died in the last minute. These creatures return to 1 hit point, but they can't regain hit points and they die after 1 minute. So he can bring guys back from the dead. Life from Death. When a creature the cultist can see within 30 feet fails a death save or dies, the cultist siphons their faltering life energy. The cultist chooses a creature within 30 feet of the cultist who isn't unconscious that regains 14 hit points. So it's channeling life. Really cool thematic cultist. It's not based on like the 5e standards of like, here's the different spells, the cleric spells that we would expect to have. It does lots of different things, but you probably don't want to run 12 of these guys, right? That'd be a lot of stuff to handle. This is a crunchier death cultist. This would be a great boss monster for like CR or level 2 players, right? Level 2 characters. This would be you do this and then a bunch of like regular good old cultists, and you've got a really cool fight. Excellent boss fight stat block, but not the kind of one that you'd want to run, not even as minions, but even if you've got like a main guy, you wouldn't want to throw 5 of these guys as like their support guys. Instead, you probably want to go with a simpler stat block of like, hey, we just hammer out damage, right? You can take away all these other abilities and focus, because they only get 1 death bolt. It's really these other abilities that are making the CR4 death cultist a CR4 death cultist. But if instead you just want it to be pure damage output, you can do like your CR4 specialist. And this is the one that you'd use when you need a lot of them, where they do 2 attacks, +6 to hit, 14 damage in each attack, 28 damage. It's way higher damage output than the Death Cultist does, but it's much more straightforward. They're just throwing damage out there. And now you got a bunch of guys throwing 28 damage with each of them. So I hope this kind of gives you a good example of how we have all of these different kinds of stat blocks, from very, very simple stat blocks that you could find in like Forge of Foes to more interesting, tactically superior stat blocks that you would find in a book like Flea Mortals, and then sort of the mid-range stat blocks that you would find in a book like The Monstrous Menagerie, and the best cases to use one over the other. using complicated stat blocks for big main monsters, named monsters that you want to have, and then using very simple stat blocks for all of the minions that are kind of off to the side. Not the minions from like Flea Mortals, but just smaller monsters that are kind of on the screen and then off the screen quickly. That's when simpler stat blocks can really get along well. If you enjoyed this show and you want more stuff like this from me, please consider subscribing to the Sly Flourish newsletter. You get a free adventure generator PDF for signing up, and you get a weekly RPG related email sent right to your inbox. It's absolutely free to sign up. You can also support me directly on Patreon. You get access to the Patreon Q&A, City of Arch's source book, a dedicated Discord server, a whole bunch of tools to help you run your games, lots of different things you get, lots of Forge of Foes stuff that you get for being a patron of Sly Flourish. You get lots of really great stuff. And you can support me on the Sly Flourish bookstore by picking up Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, Forge of Foes, and all of my other books in the Sly Flourish bookstore. Thank you all so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG. Bye-bye.